All right, we're going to get started, and maybe people can wander in from the break at their leisure. Um, Good afternoon. My name is Albert Park. I'm the Chief Economist and the Director General of the Economic Research and Development Impact Department here at ADB. And I want to welcome all of you to this session on investing in human capital in a post-pandemic era. And as I thought about the topic for today's session, I think one way to think about it is, how has the pandemic changed the way we think about how we should be investing in human capital? And I think there's several aspects of that. One is, of course, we saw a really dramatic leap in digitalization and technological change in the way we work during the pandemic. And that creates a lot of challenges to think about what are the right skills that people will need in a world of continually rapid technological change. The second, of course, in education is that we saw quite a huge disruption to education during the pandemic with extended school closures and a lot of different responses by educational systems to deal with that challenge. And did we learn anything about how to do education better from that experience in terms of educational technology or other ways of supporting the learning outcomes of children? And then finally, having gone through that very disruptive period, as we look to the future, how should we think about making our education systems more resilient to be prepared for the next time this might happen? And finally, another thing that has happened during the pandemic is because governments have really made very strong efforts to support vulnerable groups during the pandemic, they have been spending more money and now have elevated debt levels. And so the fiscal space is really much tighter for many governments, which just highlights that they need to make smart decisions about how they spend their money, especially in education, but really across the board to meet all of the different goals of meeting the SDGs, climate change in particular. So with that motivation, we put together a really terrific panel of economists from both the private sector and the public sector to talk about these issues, about how we should think about investing in human capital in a post-pandemic era. Let me briefly introduce all of the panelists, and then we'll start on a first round of questions. And so I'm going to maybe do 2 rounds of questions with the panelists and then open it up for Q&A. So as you know, if you want to ask questions, you need to type them into the Q&A system and it'll show up for me to then convey to our panelists. So our first speaker is Elisa DiCaprio. She's the chief economist at R3, which is a company, which is an enterprise blockchain firm. And so she provides economic advice on developments in blockchain, digital assets, central bank digital currencies, trade and payments, which is really kind of definitely at the forefront of technological change. Our second speaker is Najma Raja, and she is the Director of Economics at Global Public Policy at Netflix. Before working at Netflix, she was an economist at the UK public service broadcaster for over 13 years. So really a media and expert, an entertainment field expert. Our third speaker is Thomas Kelly, who is the Director of Evidence for Policy Learning at 3IE. 3IE has an agenda to strengthen evidence cultures and to develop practical solutions to facilitate evidence use. Prior to serving at 3IE, Mr. Kelly served as Deputy Vice President for the Department of Policy and Evaluation at the Millennium Challenge Corporation in the US. And our final speaker is Beth King, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and former Director of Education and Vice President for Human Development at the World Bank. So terrific panel. Let me start by turning first to our private sector economists. I always relish the opportunity to talk to people in the private sector to understand what's really happening in the real world. So, and Elisa, I can't stay with us for long, but I hope she can contribute to this first question. So Elisa, can we put her on the screen for everyone? R3 helps transform financial markets to operate with greater efficiency and transparency using blockchain and digital asset technologies. Sorry, can we put Elisa up on the screen? How will such technologies affect the skills needed in the financial sector, and can those skills be found in developing countries? In particular, what about R3's own experience finding and training engineers to use these latest technologies?
I think this is really a terrific question. The first is, because we're working in blockchain, the technology is too new to have large groups of qualified engineers. So when it comes to computer engineering, there's really nothing country specific about it.
Hi, Elisa, can you hear us?
I can.
Great.
How's that? No. Hey guys, did that help?
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, we can hear you.
So, you can?
Yes.
Well, at least that's a start. Excellent. Okay, well, why don't I just kind of answer this very, very quickly, because I know there's a lot of interest in the rest of this panel. So I think for us, because the technology is too new to have a large group of qualified engineers, we generally go through a lot of technology firms. We go through private companies. And we don't expect our engineers to have college degrees. It's not really about the exact knowledge that you have. It's more about kind of the way that you think about computer engineering. So we're looking for very basically trained engineers. Most of our engineers are in developing countries in Thailand, India, the Philippines. And largely what we do is we hire engineers with specific skills, and then we train them ourselves. I mean, that's what you have to do when you have a kind of frontier technology like this. And I think that's important, because we're not looking for the highest, most cutting edge skills. We're looking for basic skills. And then how can we train them up? And we have a whole system of training available for that. We work with different partners to do that. So I think it's really, and I hope, something that we're going to continue to do.
How long does it take to train new workers? And what do you look for when you're trying to screen who to include in your training program?
Well, it probably, I mean, we would start them working right away, learning to code, learning to build apps. It takes about, I would say, 3 to 6 months to train them when they're already hired. And in terms of what we're looking for, often English language is very helpful, but not necessary. And certainly, basic STEM skills. So we're looking for people that have kind of a focus on STEM, or at least a focus on the way, an interest in building apps, or, even computer games, things like that. Anything that we could translate into blockchain is what we're looking for.
And they're working remotely, or they're coming to some office?
No, everybody works remotely.
Everyone works remotely. Okay, so this is really digital services trade, which is the fastest growing part of the global economy today. Thanks so much, Elisa. I know you have to run, so I really appreciate your taking the time in your busy schedule to join us.
Thank you so much.
Let me turn next to Najma, sitting to my left. So Netflix is an online entertainment service which has grown very quickly. And in the post-pandemic era, has there been any change in the types of skills required in your industry? And are there any barriers or challenges to upskilling? And what are the solutions to those challenges?
Thanks, Albert. Just before I answer the question, I just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity to speak here. This is my first trip to Manila, first trip to the ADB, and I'm delighted to be here. Anyway, to answer your question, the pandemic had a devastating impact on so many aspects of everyday life, but it actually normalized new ways of working. For Netflix, in March 2022, productions ground to a halt. But within a few months, they were back up and running. And this was because the pandemic brought forward new ways of working and new technologies, in particular, the use of virtual productions. Now, the benefits of virtual production were game-changing. Firstly, it meant that our productions no longer had to be tied to one location, but it also meant that people working in the TV and film industry were able to do things better, cheaper, and quicker. But as always, when there's advantages, there's always challenges. So firstly, the new ways of working highlighted that there were severe skill shortages in some areas, in post-production, in VFX, but also that there was a real lack of people who had both a combination of STEM subjects and arts. The other aspect, or the other challenge, is that it highlighted that there were severe barriers to upskilling that were specific to our industry. Now, the one thing about TV and film production is that it relies very heavily on freelancers. Most of our production crews are made up of people who work for themselves. Now, research shows that people who work for themselves are much less likely to invest in training than people who work for companies. In particular, the key barriers are time and costs. So what can the government do to address these barriers? Well, as an economist, I'd always say that there are two solutions, one on the demand side and one on the supply side. And on the demand side, we feel that there's much that government can do to highlight the skills shortages and to also provide lots of information on the sorts of jobs that are available. In a fast-changing industry like ours, sometimes the jobs that are in demand didn't even exist 2 years ago. So how can people apply for those jobs and upskill for those jobs if they don't even know they exist? And then on the supply side, and this is a common request, I'm sure, but it's investment in provision of and access to high-quality training. Now, at Netflix, we've had some experience with that. In the wake of the pandemic, we introduced a fund for creative equity that provided bespoke training opportunities for people who were in our sector. And the goal of this was to provide opportunities for new voices and new perspectives. Now, we know that this isn't an easy ask of government, particularly as you alluded to, many governments around the world are operating against severe financial challenges. But we think that investment in these schemes will pay dividends through improved prospects for economic growth.
Great, thanks. Maybe I can follow up with a couple of quick questions. So can you explain what you mean by virtual production? And this is a new way of producing Netflix products?
So what it is that, well, traditionally in the TV sector, you'd have to go to a location to actually film in that specific place. But with virtual production through technology, you can recreate those locations through use of LED screens. So it means that, you no longer have to travel, say, to, I don't know, the desert. You can be in a studio in London. But the thing about the use of these new technologies is that critically they require people who not only can code, but they also, say, have graphic designer skills. And so
there's a lot of new kind of technology behind making that virtual production system work. And then the other thing you said is that there were some new jobs created that never existed before. And I was wondering if you could give an example or two of what kind of jobs were like that, completely new jobs.
Well, I think it relates to the virtual production technologies that I spoke about. So, for example, in post-production, we require jobs called colorists. So those are the people that once they get the footage that was filmed, they upload it, and they need to adjust the color levels so that, colors look bright rather than dingy. Similarly, on the sound editing side. And as I said before, that not only requires people who can code because it's all digital, but you need to have a kind of eye for a creative eye, so you can tell what is a good color to include on that.
Very interesting. Okay, I'm going to move on to Tom. So Tom, amid rising youth unemployment, many developing countries have ramped up financing for skills development. But what does the evidence tell us about how we can maximize the economic return to investing in skills development?
Okay, thank you very much, Albert, for the question. I really like getting a question about evidence. I am new to the organization I work at, which is 3IE, and 3IE is devoted to trying to get donors and governments to use evidence more. So this question about technical and vocational education and skills development, a question about evidence is really a welcome one. And in this particular area, there's good news. There's good news in that there's a growing body of evidence from rigorous evaluations that gives us a sense of what works and what does not. That's the good news. The bad news is that these evaluations so far have quite a mixed picture in terms of what TVET has been able to produce. So what I'd like to do is very quickly tick through some of the recent findings from rigorous impact evaluations on TVET. So talk a bit about where the content of TVET has been successful. Then talk a little bit about the context in which TVET has been successful. And then a little bit about institutional framework and how that relates to success or lack of success in TVET. So let me start with a recent review by JPAL, which is a sister organization to 3IE that just came out this last May, actually May of 2023, that looked at recent impact evaluations. Like the literature that came before, one of the core findings was that the actual impact on labor market outcomes in terms of more jobs, in terms of higher wages that are sustained over time has been quite uneven from TVET. But what also emerged is a pattern from some of the things that work when this does have positive labor market outcomes. So first finding, well-designed programs almost always succeed in conveying the technological knowledge, the technical knowledge that was intended. Students are acquiring the technical skills, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily getting the labor market outcomes. When they are getting the labor market outcomes, a few factors have been present. One, the combination of both classroom learning as well as hands-on, on-the-job training has led to more positive employment outcomes. Two, there is emerging evidence that career counseling, and specifically job referrals to specific industries, improves labor market outcomes. There's a recent finding from Kenya in which digital training for students was conveyed to one group, another group, the same training plus job referrals and career counseling. And the difference was a 40% higher wage rate in the group that also got career counseling that was sustained over time. Third finding has to do with soft skills. The combination of both the hands-on and technical training with soft skills, and by soft skills, we're talking about things like time management, communication skills, goal setting, adding soft skills has made all positive labor market outcomes more sustainable over time. So those are some of the findings from the content we see of TVET programs. Now a word about context. There's a recent study from the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, in which their then chief economist, Louise Fox, made a big study of TVET, coming to it with a somewhat skeptical eye, saying it doesn't always work. Why doesn't it always work? And instead of talking about the content of TVET programs, she suggested that we back up and ask ourselves, when is TVET likely to be appropriate? So focusing not on how it works in a particular instance, but the context in which it's operating. She started with the premise that what you want to look at is where your demand for jobs and employment is coming from in your current labor market and how that's likely to change over time, and to look at that in the context of structural transformation. So one of the things that she found is not entirely surprising, that in economies that are experiencing structural transformation, where there are more firms that are larger, more firms that are innovating, more firms that are outward oriented, TVET has tended to be more successful. In economies where there has yet to be structural transformation, TVET that has been focused on trying to create higher skilled workers for formal sector employment has tended to fizzle. Where it has been successful in those contexts, that is without structural transformation, it's been where the focus has been on self-employment, so training for self-employment skills. Okay. So at the core, what she's saying is, think not about TVET as a policy for pushing forward your labor market and getting youth jobs, but rather think of it as a specific response to the lack of certain skills in the labor sector. Okay? Do I have one more minute?
Sure.
Okay. Okay, I'm borrowing from my time from my next question now because I wanted to get to this last point about another donor, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, MCC, that has a lot of experience with TVET programs and that has started to think about how institutionally we should think about TVET training. MCC had, while I was there, TVET programs in 8 or 9 countries, 50 different programs, 140,000 students, 2 generations. In their first generation, they found that the students acquired the skills that we hoped they would get at MCC, but the labor market outcomes were fairly consistently not what we hoped, mediocre at best. The MCC created a fairly complex theoretical framework for how to think about making these programs work. And what it found was that in these programs, the content was right. They were teaching the right content. The context was right. They were in countries where the emerging market firms were saying to them, we need this kind of labor. What was wrong was the training itself was failing. The training centers were not delivering on the content. So the question was, why is that true? The answer, according to MCC, was that these training centers were not accountable to their core clients, both the job seekers and the private sector firms that could increase productivity from them. So that was their sort of core finding. They've got a complex theoretical framework about long accountability, short accountability, drawing from the World Bank literature, but very quickly to give you a sense of how they tried to get around this. In one emerging market they went to, the government said, we want to build new large training centers that we will finance and we will run in automobiles and aeronautics. MCC went to the private sector and said, what do you think about this? And the automobile industry and the aeronautics industry said, that's a terrible idea. We're going to form employers associations. If you build these facilities, we will staff them. We will provide the content and the pedagogy and the training. When they did this, through MCC's financing, 90% of graduates got jobs. The previous experience with the government, it was 50%. So a shift to keeping the private sector close. Right. I think I doubled my 3 minutes. So
Thanks, Tom. No, so that's really helpful though, because you really point at all of the places where it can go wrong that you need to really be thinking about from the demand side, but then the design side and the content and how you deliver the content. So let me turn to Beth. So one thing that Tom mentioned was that the kind of social skills were also important for success. And so we know economists in the private sector often emphasize the importance of embracing educational technology now to ensure high quality educational outcomes, but there is this concern about less human interaction. So is there a trade-off, do you think, between pushing new education technologies and nurturing socio-emotional skills? And are there strategies in general to make sure students develop socio-emotional skills successfully?
So as an economist, we love the word trade-offs, right? We think there are trade-offs everywhere. I would say in this case, I don't think, it depends on how we use it, but I don't think there's a trade-off because, in fact, the key word would be, or the key phrase would be pedagogical reform. Technology, bringing technology into education should not be about adding one more subject, but rather just changing the way we do education. This was the topic, and this was discussed in the first session this morning. And I love this session because it's saying, let's stop thinking about technology in education as technology is a tool, but rather that it's actually going to change everything about our lives, places we work in, the things that we do. And so once we think about technology as something that is going to be really being embedded in the fabric of our lives and our work, then it's no longer just a tool. I mean, of course, we will have to know how to deal with it, but it's much, much more than a tool, and therefore an added subject in the curriculum is not going to do the trick. we have to actually build it into the way teachers are trained, the way they teach their classes, and the way and the way we evaluate students about whether they learned something or not. Last night I got a feed from Forbes where a survey of employers said found the conclusion was that 49% of jobs today will disappear in 2 years. That shocked a lot of people. 2 years just too fast. But many employers apparently said it can happen because the march of technology into industry, into the workplace is actually accelerating. It might be really an exaggeration, but let's say it's 5 years instead of 2, or even 10 years instead of 2. Are our education systems actually prepared to equip students with the kinds of skills they need for this for the changes that we will see in the workplace? The traditional way, the traditional mode of teaching requires students first to remember. That's the main point. The rote teaching is about students remembering facts. Again, this was mentioned earlier and referring to how we learn our history. It's all about facts and remembering them. What we need is actually to help students begin to understand, evaluate evidence that's there, and also even create. So it's a very different form of pedagogy that we want to have. The Idan Prize, the Idan Foundation awarded a prize just last month to Micheline Chi of the Arizona State University. It's like the Nobel Prize for Education. And the reason why she got the award was because it's very related to what we're discussing today, which is children. Students learn best when they're not in a passive learning environment. Now, many of us know about this, that it should be active. But what she was saying, besides being active, where you actually do some things, it has to be, the action has to be constructive, has to be manipulative, has to create to create something. And then a fourth thing is actually about interactions, that students learn best and remember best when they can actually interact with others. So here comes the point about sort of if you're just interacting with a machine rather than with people. And her study, a history of research on this shows that interactive classrooms are much better for effective communication, for effective education. You asked Albert about socio-emotional skills. So again, that survey of employers, of entrepreneurs, were saying what we need is actually no longer the ability to even extract facts, but actually to be able to interpret them, to criticize the evidence that we see, very important. What is true, what is not true, what is good evidence, what is bad evidence, because not all facts will have value, and then to construct from the evidence knowledge itself. So socio-emotional skills require that. Social-emotional skills means a greater ability to do these things, for students themselves to be able to get into self-explanations. They have to understand the environment that they are in the workplace and in life. Socio-emotional skills also include, well, of course, problem solving, the value of teamwork, openness to new things. So again, that's a very important part of the technological change, is innovation, new ways of doing things, even new ways of thinking. So openness as a socio-emotional skill is very important. And I think in the that's the big challenge in our classrooms today and the school system, is how do we teach students that? If we're just giving them facts rather than asking them why, you know, trying to ask them to relate things to their own environment. That's the only way we can actually build those socio-emotional skills of problem solving, critical thinking, and teamwork.
Great. Thanks so much, Beth. We're going to do a second round of questions, but I'm going to ask our speakers to try to keep the time brief so we can have time for Q&A. And the question, and it's one question for everybody, how can education systems become more resilient to shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic, and what is the role of technology and adoption? And before I turn it over to the speakers, I wanted to communicate some of the findings of research that we've been doing in the research department on the learning loss crisis, which we've been tracking very carefully since the pandemic started. And we've have produced a couple of studies which are still preliminary. One was based on phone-based surveys in 6 ASEAN, Southeast Asian countries about what happened to the pandemic, and part of it is about what happened to children. And that survey found that the majority of children, based on their parents' assessment, had some issue of delayed learning or lost learning during the pandemic. And in particular, boys and the poor were more likely to do worse. And students who had access to internet-based learning when schools were closed or multiple learning modes tended to do better. And another study that we're just finishing is a meta-analysis of all of the rigorous studies of learning loss globally. And we reviewed about 50 studies and found that 1 year of school closure led to lost learning of about 1.4 years, which you can already see is not very good math. I mean, because in addition to not learning for a year, you're also forgetting by not being in school for a year. And then evaluating 20 different interventions designed to remediate learning loss or reduce learning loss, we found that individual tutoring, teaching to the right level, and also some examples of technology-assisted learning actually were effective in reducing learning loss. So with that, I want to turn it back over to Najma, maybe, and you can maybe say a few words about your thoughts on how to build resilient education systems.
Thank you. I think there's 2 points I'd like to make. The first one is the importance of tapping into new and growing sources of demand. Now, some of you may know that Netflix launched in 2007 as an online retailer of DVDs. Now, today, in 2023, we have over 230 million paid subscribers across the world. But we're also part of a growing creative economy that's booming, a creative economy that doesn't only include the TV and film production sector, but games, VFX, music, performing arts, and many other sectors. Now, if education systems are going to tap into that growing source of potential demand, it's important that they tailor their programs to the needs of a changing labour market. In plain terms, that has 2 implications. Firstly, it's important that companies in the education sector stay up to speed with industry trends. But I think more importantly, it's critical that they also stay one step ahead. And in particular, technological changes, such as increased penetration of high-speed broadband and proliferation of connected devices like tablets, like mobile phones, because we think that those 2 key factors will be drivers of demand for the education system. And that takes me on to my next point, which relates to working in partnership with companies like Netflix to develop online learning solutions, and also taking the opportunity to innovate and experiment. Now, at Netflix, we've had some experience with this. Over the last 2 years, we've been working in partnership with the Inter-American Development Bank on an initiative called Sandbox. Well, what's Sandbox all about? Well, Sandbox provides high quality online learning and in-person training for young people who want to build their careers in the TV and film production sector. We rolled it out in February 2023 in Colombia to great success. When we launched it, we immediately received 7,000 applications. That's 5 times higher than the level that we anticipated. Now, the evaluation of the scheme is still ongoing, but the early signs and insights from the scheme, from the evaluation, look promising, with participants for Sandbox citing that their employment prospects in the sector had already improved. So looking ahead, we think that there's much more potential for more initiatives like Sandbox, and because they allow companies to develop and experiment. And we think, again, that it's worth investing in these solutions in order to equip the labour force with a set of 21st century skills.
Great, thanks. So one thing that strikes me in hearing you and also Elisa was, there is this issue of, what should the private sector should it be doing itself to help train workers for new technologies, and what should be the responsibility of governments in terms of the educational system, and how do we have appropriate division of labor? Maybe we'll go to Tom next. You got borrowed from this time.
Yeah, I know. I stole from my time earlier, so I'll be quicker this time. One thing I would say to people in charge of education systems is to listen very closely to what Albert said earlier about the evidence from this last experience. The next time this happens, there's going to be a public policy debate again within government, within society, about closing schools. And we heard a lot about learning losses there, and that will be a conversation again in future. And we know that from this experience what the evidence says, both about the advisability of doing that from a public health perspective, but also the impact on education. Let me add 2 quick things to the evidence that Albert talked about. One is, both are from outside the region. In Sierra Leone, in a previous pandemic, in Ebola, when the Ebola hit, when they closed schools for a short period of time, when they reopened them, 1 out of every 6 girls did not show up, did not re-enroll, and they were lost to the education system forever. Think about that. In Brazil, during this last experience, there was a rigorous impact evaluation of a natural experiment where there were otherwise similar schools. Some were fully remote, some were actually in person. Those that were fully remote, 3 times as likely students were to drop out. The students that stayed had a 75% loss in education compared to the students that stayed. So dramatic impacts, and this conversation is going to happen again. If schools do go remote again, so the role of technology, there are things we have learned also. First of all, simple things. Cell phone penetration is extremely high. So even in cases where there's not internet or students don't have tablets or computers, students do have cell phones. And simple things like nudges sent by text have been highly successful at keeping students engaged. Again, rigorous impact evaluation, you send a text to a high school student and talk about the advantages of graduation, it is a statistically significant impact. More complex things, adaptive teaching software. So Albert also talked about tutoring and meeting students where there are adaptive softwares that can help adapt to where a student is to meet them where they are. They can be highly successful in teaching. Finally, the last thing is to focus on teachers. The teachers need assistance and training on ICT and pedagogy in this remote context also.
So just following up on this point about connectivity, the one country I read about that did not have learning loss on average was Korea, and it's really the most connected online place in the world, I guess. Let me turn it to Beth.
Yes. So because I've also borrowed from this section, from this round, I'm going to be very short. First, I agree with what Najma and Tom said. So listen very carefully, and also what Albert mentioned. I want to point out only one thing. It may not be another pandemic that we need to prepare for, but many, many of our countries in the region suffer on an annual basis. Super typhoons, earthquakes, floods, fires, not to mention political and civil unrest. And each one of those have led to the closure of schools, transport strikes. I mean, name it. We cannot say that this is this is something that governments have to actually prepare for. It has to be part of doing business. No education plan should be missing a learning continuity plan. We cannot keep on talking about climate change and not prepare for it. So this is something that we need to make sure our school systems do, have a learning continuity plan, and it will depend on technology. Lesson from Korea, because I was just reading about what they did. One of the most important things they did, besides the connectivity already there before, is that they also didn't believe that they could do everything successfully. So it was trial and error, phased in online teaching. So it was closure, then phased in online teaching, first at the university level, then secondary level. And only after they learned from each one of those did they go to the lowest level of schooling. So, and monitoring of what they were doing and evaluating the impact of what they were doing as they were doing these things. So all those very, very important lessons from Korea.
Thanks, Beth. So there was talking about natural disasters as a source of educational disruption. There's a pretty influential study about Pakistan earthquake, where they found that the initial learning loss was pretty large, but then every year the learning loss got worse and worse and worse.
It's cumulative.
Because the system was losing them. They were right behind, and there was no structured way to approach to try to remediate them and bring them back up. And so they just kept going further and further home. But recently, there's a study in one of the provinces in India from the pandemic where, after the first year and the second year, about half of the learning loss, or even more than half of the learning loss, was remediated very quickly. And that was an approach where they followed some of the best practice in terms of having a program focusing on foundational skills and bringing kids back up. So, these are really important lessons, I think, for thinking about dealing with all sorts of disruptions in the future. Okay, so I'm going to we have about 12 minutes left. Please feel free to ask more questions in the Q&A. The first question is, with the most votes, what is ADB's research agenda regarding the impact of emerging technologies on the labor market and skills demand of Asia and the Pacific during the post-COVID world? So I guess that's a question for me, although please chime in if you think there are things that should be on the research agenda in doing this. And my response would be actually before I even came to ADB almost 2 years ago, I was doing a lot of work on labor economics and the changing nature of work. And I was part of a research project where we tried to get actually survey data from many different countries, wherever the data was available, on what was the actual task content of work. And there are some good surveys that have been done in maybe 30 or 40 countries. And we tried to look separately at what was going on in developed countries and developing countries, because there's this whole narrative, that technologies like computers and automation are replacing kind of the routine tasks. And so jobs that had more routine tasks would be, those jobs would disappear. And that explains wage inequality in advanced countries. But one thing interesting we found is that the pattern is not so simple in developing countries. Mm-hmm. That in fact, this whole idea of the routine jobs getting replaced is a much less robust finding in developing countries if you actually have direct data on what each worker is doing. And in particular, we found that it's actually in the high skill jobs, the professionals, the technical workers with high skill level, where the routineness of their jobs was actually much more routine than the same occupation in developed countries. So a manager in developing countries was doing more routine tasks in his job than a manager in advanced countries. So there's all these kind of interesting differences. And even the decline of routine jobs was much less pronounced in developing countries compared to rich countries. That had kind of been assumed, making lots of, I think, strong assumptions that jobs in developing countries for the same occupation were just the same as the US, and all the measurements of job titles were coming from the US in the previous literature. Now, what are we doing now? Based on that experience, we're trying to actually do these similar types of surveys of labor forces in Asia. I see Paul in the audience. I think he's directing some of this work. And so initially we're working in a few countries, including Philippines, Georgia, hopefully Nepal, where we are basically piggybacking on their labor force surveys or adding a separate survey to ask questions about the task content of jobs. And we're also trying to ask questions about digitalization and other kind of exposures to different technology to try to get a more direct sense of how the changing nature of work is really evolving in response to changes in technology and also changes to globalization and to changes in the skills training of workers. So that's ongoing. I think it's important. We had Daron Acemoglu, a very famous economist from MIT working on technology and the labor market, visit us as a distinguished speaker the first year I was here. And when he met our president, President Massa, in a one-on-one meeting, I was there to help facilitate. And President Massa asked Daron, what can we do at ADB to help? Because Daron was emphasizing this idea that technology was actually going to displace low-skilled work in many countries. And Daron said, the first thing you can do is measure, do surveys so we understand what's happening in developing countries where we have made a lot of assumptions, but we need to continue understanding. So I was like cheering behind him after he said that, because that supports, I think, the research direction that we're also trying to take. But we have to be patient. We don't really have a lot of new results, but there's a lot of interest in I think, doing this kind of research. I think it needs to be done to keep tracking what's happening in the labor market.
You can also measure socio-emotional skills.
Absolutely.
In the region. There are a few already from a few countries from the region, Laos and Vietnam. You can do more.
Thanks for that advice. It's helpful. Okay, so here's a question. How can we help ensure that increased efforts on digitalization do not come at the expense of our human resources? I guess is technology substituting for workers. Anyone want to tackle that? Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm drawing from my own experience. I mentioned virtual production, and what we're seeing is, you're right, there is the move towards actually creation of more high quality, high skills jobs, which actually leads to higher wages, higher productivity. So as long as the building bricks are in place to make sure that people are able to upskill, it should be a win-win.
Great. Any other thoughts?
I guess we're all economists up here and we all think alike, but I would just pile on a bit and say that making sure that people have the skills necessary to access the potential associated with higher productivity technology is the key way to go.
I think economists tend to be technology optimists, that there will always be jobs created even as technology changes, where engineers are technology pessimists. They think, oh, I can replace that job, it's gone. And the other thing I'd like to say about digitalization is digital technology has some unique abilities to help small businesses overcome fixed cost barriers to, like, marketing, to having to have a store stall. You can just do some stuff from your home. And so in principle, there's a lot of job creation opportunities, even for unskilled work or for remote located, that could help make development more inclusive. But it does require, that everyone has this access and has ability to use these platforms, and not just to be connected, but to be able to do it at an affordable rate. So there's a concept of internet poverty, right, that I think is important. It's not enough just to have a good system. It has to be affordable to the poor.
I'm not necessarily a technology optimist. I am, but also I have this really sinking feeling in my stomach about poor countries and also the populations in some of the less poor countries who are left behind. Left behind not so much in terms of technology, but in terms of the quality of their teachers. If the teachers are not trained to use the technology well, we're going to get technology well in order to improve their own productivity and their own efficacy. I'm just afraid that we really are looking at a broader, a bigger and bigger gap in the quality of education between those who will have access to the best teachers and those who don't. And that, I think, is going to be because technology will help the richer areas and the places that have better teachers. And the teachers in the poorer areas, in the more disadvantaged areas, will not know how to use the technology themselves.
Food for thought. So let me, we have just a few minutes left. Let me see if anybody wants to answer this question about, given the focus at upskilling and reskilling, should the division between public responsibility for pre-service and employer-employee responsibility not be rethought? So how should we think about, the role of the public sector versus the private sector in training or skills development? Any thoughts from our panel?
So I think that it's the role of government to set the standards on education and to set those standards within a world that is more and more increasingly digitalized or more with more smart technology. So those so the standards that we have, the kinds of the supervision of schools, those should all of these things should actually change because they were built, they were developed for a world that did not have the kind of smart technology that we have. And I think that's the main job of the public sector. And as I said earlier, also, the public sector should think about, if education is so important, it should also be protected from the assaults from climate change, from natural disasters, from pandemics, etc. And then give the private sector more autonomy to actually do a good job of bringing better and better technology.
Great, thanks. So we're almost at the end. I'm going to finish with a very rapid fire question for each of our panelists to conclude. And that is, what is the one piece of advice you would give to policymakers on preparing students in a rapidly changing technological environment? So, Anja?
Well, I think I picked up on this in one of my answers, but actually just highlighting where the skill gaps are, highlighting the job opportunities so that students know what subjects to study for future jobs.
Give them information. Tom?
I'm going to look farther out and say the exact opposite thing, that we do not know where the changes are going to come in the future, which industries will be disrupted, and where the labor market premium will be. So I think it's very important for students to be flexible and to adaptable. And in those areas, I would focus on teaching the critical skills of the language of technology. Those critical skills are math, and for now, English, maybe not in the future, but math and English in the short term. And then I would also focus on critical thinking skills. There's some very interesting research coming out of the Lancet on students' ability to learn critical thinking in the classroom and the difference it makes. And lastly, soft skills.
Beth, last word.
Last word. Bite the bullet. Government should bite the bullet and transform teacher training. Unless teachers are trained in a different way, unless they are trained to actually live in the kind of world we have now, and that's going to be more and more digital, they will not be able to teach in the classroom. They just simply won't be able to do their job properly.
Great. And with that, I'd like to thank all of our panelists and give them a big round of applause for a very fascinating session. And thank all of you for spending your time to listen to us. Thanks.
I was just thinking out 50 years instead of yeah, you as well. Yes, I'll check it down.
You still remember me?
Yes, no. Good to see you. I was looking at you and I wanted
for the
to
past
say,
15 years.
yes, I know. Was it only 15 years? Oh, yeah, probably.
No,
Only
ating
15
masasayang araw, ating mga pagkain din sa tabi, sa payag natin. Hindi ka na